Emily Parker slouched in her seat, trying to make herself as small as possible. Her heart raced as Mr. Blackwood's steely gaze swept across the classroom, knowing it was only a matter of time before those cold eyes landed on her. She gripped her pencil tightly, willing her hand not to shake as she scribbled nonsensical answers on her test paper. "Time's up," Mr. Blackwood announced, his voice cutting through the tense silence. "Pass your papers forward." Emily's stomach churned as she reluctantly handed her test to the student in front of her. She knew what was coming next. It was the same routine that had plagued her for the past 3 years. Mr. Blackwood collected the stack of papers, his lips curling into a sneer as he reached Emily's desk. "Well, Miss Parker, let's see how spectacularly you've failed this time." The other students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, averting their eyes from the scene unfolding before them. They'd witnessed this cruel ritual countless times, but none dared to intervene. With deliberate slowness, Mr. Blackwood flipped through Emily's test, his eyebrows rising with mock surprise. My, he drawled. "It seems you've outdone yourself today. I didn't think it was possible to answer every single question incorrectly, but you've managed it." Emily's cheeks burned with humiliation as a few stifled giggles echoed through the room. She stared at her desk, wishing she could disappear. "Tell me, Miss Parker," Mr. Blackwood continued, leaning close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath. "Do you enjoy wasting my time and that of your classmates? Or are you simply incapable of retaining even the most basic information?" Emily's voice was barely a whisper as she replied, "I'm sorry, Mr. Blackwood. I tried my best." "Your best," he scoffed. "If this is your best, then I shudder to think what your worst might look like. Perhaps it's time we discuss your future in this class. See me after school." As Mr. Blackwood moved on to discuss the test with the rest of the class, Emily felt the familiar sting of tears threatening to spill. She blinked rapidly, determined not to cry in front of everyone. It was bad enough being the target of Mr. Blackwood's constant ridicule. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her break down. The rest of the day passed in a blur of anxiety and dread. When the final bell rang, Emily's feet felt like lead as she made her way back to Mr. Blackwood's classroom. She paused outside the door, taking a deep breath to steel herself before knocking softly. "Enter," came the curt response. Emily stepped inside, her eyes immediately drawn to Mr. Blackwood's imposing figure behind his desk. He didn't look up from the papers he was grading, leaving her to stand awkwardly in silence for several long moments. Finally, he set down his red pen and fixed her with a piercing stare. "Miss Parker," he began, his tone dripping with disdain, "I've been teaching for over 20 years, and in all that time, I've never encountered a student quite like you." Emily's heart sank. She knew what was coming, another lecture about her inadequacies, her failures, her worthlessness. It was a speech she'd heard in various forms since freshman year, when she'd first had the misfortune of being assigned to Mr. Blackwood's class. "You seem to possess a unique talent for failure," he continued, rising from his chair and circling around to lean against the front of his desk. "It's almost impressive, really, how consistently you manage to disappoint. Tell me, do you apply this level of incompetence to all areas of your life, or do you save it specially for my class?" Emily's voice trembled as she replied, "I really am trying, Mr. Blackwood. I study every night, I dash." "Clearly not hard enough," he interrupted. "Or perhaps you're simply not cut out for academic pursuits. Have you considered a career in fast food? I hear they're always looking for people who excel at following simple instructions, though even that might be beyond your capabilities." Tears welled up in Emily's eyes, but she blinked them back furiously. She wouldn't cry. She wouldn't give him that satisfaction. Mr. Blackwood's lips curled into a cruel smile as he noticed her struggle. "Oh, come now, Miss Parker. There's no need for tears. I'm merely being honest about your prospects, something your other teachers seem reluctant to do. Consider it a public service." He turned back to his desk, rifling through a drawer before pulling out a form. "I've taken the liberty of preparing a transfer request," he said, sliding the paper across the desk towards her. "I think it's best for everyone if you remove yourself from my class. Perhaps you'll find more success in a less challenging environment." Emily stared at the form, her vision blurring. This was it, the culmination of years of torment and humiliation. Mr. Blackwood was finally succeeding in pushing her out of his class, just as he'd been trying to do since she first stepped foot in his classroom. "Well?" Mr. Blackwood prompted, impatience coloring his tone. "Are you going to sign it, or do you need help with that as well?" Something inside Emily snapped. Years of pent-up frustration and anger bubbled to the surface, and before she could stop herself, she heard her own voice, loud and clear, saying, "No." Mr. Blackwood's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "Excuse me." "I said no," Emily repeated, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. "I'm not signing that form, and I'm not leaving your class." For a moment, Mr. Blackwood seemed taken aback by her sudden defiance. Then his eyes narrowed dangerously. "I don't think you understand the situation, Miss Parker. This isn't a request. You're clearly not capable of keeping up with the work in this class, and I dash." "You're wrong," Emily interrupted, surprising herself with her boldness. "I am capable. I've always been capable. The only reason I struggle in this class is because of you, Mr. Blackwood. You've done nothing but tear me down and humiliate me for years. But I'm not going to let you win. I'm going to stay in this class, and I'm going to prove you wrong." Mr. Blackwood's face flushed with anger. "How dare you speak to me like that? I am your teacher, and you will show me respect." "Respect is earned," Emily shot back, her voice growing stronger with each word. "And you, Mr. Blackwood, have done nothing to earn it. You're a bully, plain and simple. But I'm not going to be your victim anymore." With that, Emily turned on her heel and strode out of the classroom, leaving a stunned Mr. Blackwood in her wake. As she walked down the empty hallway, her heart pounded in her chest, a mix of fear and exhilaration coursing through her veins. She had no idea what consequences her outburst would bring, but for the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of hope. She'd finally stood up to her tormentor, and it felt good. Little did Emily know, her act of defiance would set in motion a chain of events that would change not only her life, but the lives of everyone at Westfield High School. The next day, Emily arrived at school with a mixture of dread and determination. She half expected to be called to the principal's office immediately, certain that Mr. Blackwood would have reported her for insubordination. But as the morning passed without incident, she began to relax slightly. That is, until she walked into Mr. Blackwood's class. The moment she stepped through the door, she felt the weight of his glare. His eyes followed her as she made her way to her seat, promising retribution for her defiance the day before. "Today," Mr. Blackwood announced, his voice unnaturally calm, "we'll be having a pop quiz on yesterday's lesson. I hope you all paid attention." A collective groan rippled through the classroom, but Emily's heart sank. She knew this was aimed directly at her, punishment for daring to stand up to him. As Mr. Blackwood distributed the quiz papers, he paused at Emily's desk. "I do hope you're prepared, Miss Parker," he said quietly, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. "It would be such a shame if you were to fail again." Emily took a deep breath, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "I'll do my best, Mr. Blackwood," she replied, keeping her voice steady. The quiz was brutal. Emily recognized some of the material from her studying, but many of the questions seemed to cover topics they hadn't even touched on in class. She worked through each problem methodically, determined to do as well as she could despite the unfairness of it all. When Mr. Blackwood collected the papers, he made a show of flipping through Emily's immediately. His eyebrows rose in mock surprise. Well, he mused, loud enough for the entire class to hear. It seems Miss Parker has decided to grace us with some actual effort today, though I'm not sure it will be enough to save her from another spectacular failure. Emily felt her cheeks burn as a few of her classmates snickered, but she held her head high, refusing to let Mr. Blackwood see how much his words still affected her. As the class progressed, Mr. Blackwood seemed to take every opportunity to single Emily out. He called on her for the most difficult questions, interrupting her attempts to answer with cutting remarks about her intelligence. By the time the bell rang, Emily felt emotionally drained. She was gathering her things to leave when Mr. Blackwood's voice rang out. "Miss Parker, a word." Reluctantly, Emily approached his desk. Mr. Blackwood waited until the last student had filed out before speaking. "I hope you're pleased with yourself," he said, his voice low and threatening. "Your little outburst yesterday was quite the performance. But let me make something very clear. You will not disrespect me like that again. I've dealt with troublemakers like you before, and I always win in the end. So, I'll give you one last chance to sign that transfer form. Otherwise, I promise you, I will make the rest of your time in my class a living hell." Emily's heart raced, but she stood her ground. "I'm not signing anything, Mr. Blackwood. And I'm not leaving your class. You can try to break me all you want, but I won't let you win." Mr. Blackwood's eyes flashed with anger. "We'll see about that, Miss Parker. We'll see." As Emily left the classroom, she felt a mix of fear and determination. She knew Mr. Blackwood would make good on his threat to make her life miserable, but she was tired of being his punching bag. Something had to change, and she was resolved to be the one to make it happen. Over the next few weeks, Mr. Blackwood's treatment of Emily intensified. He seemed to take a perverse pleasure in finding new ways to humiliate her in front of the class. Pop quizzes became a daily occurrence, each one more difficult than the last. Emily's grades plummeted, despite her best efforts to keep up with the increasingly challenging material. But something unexpected began to happen. As Mr. Blackwood's cruelty became more obvious, Emily's classmates started to take notice. Whispers circulated through the hallways, and students from other classes began to ask questions about what was really going on in Mr. Blackwood's room. One day, as Emily was struggling through another impossible quiz, she felt a tap on her shoulder. She turned to see Jake, one of the popular kids who had never paid much attention to her before, sliding a folded note onto her desk. Confused, Emily carefully unfolded the paper, making sure Mr. Blackwood wasn't watching. Inside, she found a simple message: "We've got your back. Don't give up." Stunned, Emily glanced around the room. Several students met her gaze, offering small smiles or encouraging nods. For the first time in years, she didn't feel alone in her struggle against Mr. Blackwood. After class, Jake approached her in the hallway. "Hey, Emily," he said, his voice low. "A bunch of us have been talking. What Blackwood's doing to you? It's not right. We want to help." Emily felt a lump form in her throat. I don't know what to say. Thank you, but what can you do? Mr. Blackwood's been treating me like this for years, and no one's ever stepped in before." Jake ran a hand through his hair, looking uncomfortable. "Yeah, I know. We should have done something sooner. But better late than never, right? Look, we've been gathering evidence, recordings of his comments, copies of those crazy quizzes he's been giving you. We're going to take it to Principal Winters. Emily's eyes widened. You've been recording him? Jake, that could get you in serious trouble. He shrugged. Maybe, but what he's doing to you is worse. It's time someone stood up to him, and you've been doing it alone for too long. Before Emily could respond, she saw Mr. Blackwood emerging from his classroom. She quickly whispered, "Thank you, Jake. Really, but please be careful." As Mr. Blackwood approached, his eyes narrowed at the sight of Emily and Jake talking. "Miss Parker," he said, his voice dripping with disdain, "I hope you're not trying to coerce your classmates into helping you cheat. Though I suppose even that wouldn't be enough to salvage your abysmal performance in my class." Jake opened his mouth to retort, but Emily quickly cut in. "No, Mr. Blackwood. We were just discussing a group project for another class." Mr. Blackwood looked unconvinced, but he merely sneered and continued down the hallway. Once he was out of earshot, Jake turned to Emily with a look of disbelief. "How do you put up with that every day?" Emily shrugged, a sad smile on her face. "I didn't have much choice, but maybe that's changing now." Over the next few days, Emily noticed a shift in the classroom dynamics. Students who had previously ignored her or even joined in on Mr. Blackwood's taunting now offered her small gestures of support, a sympathetic smile, a quick thumbs up when Mr. Blackwood's back was turned. It wasn't much, but it gave Emily the strength to keep going. Meanwhile, Jake and a small group of other students continued to gather evidence of Mr. Blackwood's mistreatment. They recorded his verbal abuse, collected copies of the unfair quizzes, and even convinced a few former students to write statements about their experiences in his class. Emily was torn between hope and fear. Part of her was grateful for the support and excited at the possibility of finally putting an end to Mr. Blackwood's reign of terror. But another part of her was terrified of the consequences if their plan failed. Mr. Blackwood was well-connected and had been teaching at Westfield High for decades. Would anyone really believe a group of students over his word? Her fears seemed to be realized when, a week later, she was called to Principal Winters' office. As she walked down the long hallway, her heart pounding in her chest, she imagined all the worst-case scenarios. Had Mr. Blackwood somehow found out about their plan? Was she about to be expelled? When she entered the office, she was surprised to see not only Principal Winters, but also Mr. Blackwood and a woman she didn't recognize seated around the large desk. Miss Parker," Principal Winters said, his expression unreadable. "Please have a seat." Emily sat down nervously, acutely aware of Mr. Blackwood's glare burning into the side of her head. Principal Winters cleared his throat. "Miss Parker, I've called you here today because some serious allegations have been brought to my attention regarding your experiences in Mr. Blackwood's class. This is Ms. Thompson from the school board." He gestured to the unknown woman, who offered Emily a kind smile. "We'd like to hear your side of the story." Emily's mind raced. This was it, the moment she'd both hoped for and dreaded. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. "It's all nonsense," Mr. Blackwood interjected before Emily could speak. "Principal Winters, I've told you, this is nothing more than a vindictive attempt by a failing student to discredit me. Miss Parker has been struggling in my class for years, and rather than take responsibility for her own shortcomings, she's concocted these ridiculous accusations." Miss Thompson held up a hand, silencing him. "Mr. Blackwood, you'll have your chance to speak. Right now, We'd like to hear from Emily." She turned to Emily with an encouraging nod. "Go ahead, dear. Tell us what's been happening." Emily looked down at her hands, gathering her courage. Then, slowly, she began to speak. Her voice trembled at first but grew stronger as she recounted the years of verbal abuse, public humiliation, and unfair treatment she had endured in Mr. Blackwood's class. She described the constant, belittling comments, the impossibly difficult pop quizzes designed to make her fail, and the way Mr. Blackwood seemed to take pleasure in her struggles. As she spoke, she could see Principal Winter's expression changing from skepticism to concern. "It wasn't just me," Emily added, her voice barely above a whisper. "Other students, they've been through it too. Some of them might be willing to come forward if—" "That's enough," Mr. Blackwood suddenly bellowed, slamming his hand on the desk. "This is preposterous. I've been teaching at this school for over 2 decades. My record is impeccable. Are you really going to take the word of this underachieving student over mine?" Ms. Thompson fixed Mr. Blackwood with a stern look. "Mr. Blackwood, please control yourself. We're here to listen to all sides of this situation." Principal Winters leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "Emily, these are very serious allegations. Do you have any evidence to support your claims?" Emily hesitated, not wanting to implicate her classmates. But she knew this might be her only chance to make things right. There are recordings," she said quietly, "and copies of the quizzes. Other students have been collecting them." Mr. Blackwood's face turned an alarming shade of red. "Recordings? That's a violation of school policy. Those students should be expelled immediately." "That's not your decision to make, Mr. Blackwood," Ms. Thompson said sharply. She turned back to Emily. "Can you provide us with these recordings and other evidence?" Emily nodded, relief washing over her. "Yes, I can get them for you." Principal Winters sighed heavily, rubbing his temples. "All right. Emily, please bring all the evidence you have to my office tomorrow morning. Mr. Blackwood, I'm placing you on administrative leave pending a full investigation." "This is outrageous," Mr. Blackwood sputtered. "You can't possibly dash." "That's enough, Robert," Principal Winters cut him off. "This meeting is adjourned. Emily, you're free to go." As Emily left the office, her legs felt weak with relief and residual fear. She had done it. She had finally spoken out against Mr. Blackwood. But what would happen now? The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Emily, along with Jake and the other students who had been gathering evidence, presented everything they had to Principal Winters and Ms. Thompson. The recordings were damning, clearly capturing Mr. Blackwood's verbal abuse and unfair treatment. More students came forward with their own stories, emboldened by Emily's bravery. Even a few former students, now in college or working, reached out to share their experiences in Mr. Blackwood's class. As the investigation progressed, the school atmosphere began to change. Students who had previously kept their heads down, afraid of becoming Mr. Blackwood's next target, now walked the halls with a newfound confidence. Teachers who had suspected something was amiss but had never felt empowered to speak up now voiced their concerns. Emily found herself at the center of it all, a reluctant hero to her peers. Students she had never spoken to before now approached her in the hallways, thanking her for her courage or sharing their own stories of mistreatment. But not everyone was supportive. Some students, particularly those who had been Mr. Blackwood's favorites, accused Emily of lying or exaggerating. Nasty rumors began to circulate, suggesting that she was just seeking attention or trying to cover up her own academic failures. Through it all, Emily tried to stay focused on her studies and the ongoing investigation. She was surprised to find that without Mr. Blackwood's constant belittling, her grades in other classes began to improve. For the first time in years, she felt like she might actually have a future beyond high school. Finally, after what felt like an eternity but was really only a month, Emily was called back to Principal Winter's office. This time, Miss Thompson was there along with another man Emily didn't recognize. "Emily," Principal Winters began, his voice grave. "First, I want to thank you for your bravery in coming forward. The evidence you and your classmates provided was, well, it was overwhelming." Ms. Thompson nodded in agreement. "We've completed our investigation, and the findings are clear. Mr. Blackwood's behavior was completely unacceptable and in violation of numerous school policies and ethical guidelines." The unknown man cleared his throat. "Allow me to introduce myself. I'm David Carter, the district superintendent. Given the severity of this situation, I've been personally overseeing the final stages of this investigation." Emily's heart raced. The district superintendent? This was bigger than she had imagined. Mr. Carter continued, "Based on our findings, we've made the decision to terminate Mr. Blackwood's employment, effective immediately. He will not be returning to Westfield High or any other school in this district." Emily felt a wave of emotions wash over her: relief, vindication, and a touch of sadness for the years of suffering that could have been prevented if someone had acted sooner. Additionally, Mr. Carter went on, "We'll be implementing new training programs for all staff members on recognizing and reporting abuse. We're also establishing a confidential reporting system for students to voice their concerns without fear of retaliation." Principal Winters leaned forward, his expression serious. "Emily, we owe you and your classmates an apology. We should have noticed what was happening and taken action long ago. I promise you, we will do better in the future." Emily nodded, unable to find words to express the mix of emotions she was feeling. Miss Thompson smiled gently. "You've shown incredible strength and resilience, Emily. Is there anything we can do to support you moving forward?" Emily thought for a moment, then said, I think I might need some help catching up in some of my subjects. And maybe some counseling to process everything that's happened." "Of course," Principal Winters said immediately. "We'll arrange for tutoring and counseling services right away. And please, if there's anything else you need, don't hesitate to ask." As Emily left the office, she felt as though a great weight had been lifted from her shoulders. The nightmare of Mr. Blackwood's abuse was finally over. But she knew the journey wasn't over. There would be challenges ahead as she worked to rebuild her confidence and academic standing. In the hallway, she found Jake and several other students waiting anxiously. "Well?" Jake asked, his eyes wide with anticipation. Emily couldn't help but smile. "He's gone," she said simply. "Mr. Blackwood's been fired." A cheer went up from the group, drawing curious looks from other students passing by. Jake pulled Emily into a spontaneous hug, which she returned after a moment of surprise. "You did it, Emily," Jake said as he released her. "You stood up to him and won." Emily shook her head. "We did it," she corrected. "I couldn't have done this without all of you." As the news spread through the school, Emily found herself at the center of attention once again. But this time, Instead of cruel whispers and mocking laughter, she was met with words of admiration and support. In the days that followed, Emily threw herself into her studies with renewed vigor. With the help of tutors and supportive teachers, she began to make up for lost time, discovering a passion for learning that had been buried under years of Mr. Blackwood's abuse. The counseling sessions, though sometimes difficult, helped her process the trauma of the past few years and begin to rebuild her self-esteem. Slowly but surely, Emily began to recognize her own strength and worth. As the end of the school year approached, Emily found herself in a position she never thought possible. She was being considered for academic awards and scholarships. Her grades had improved dramatically, and teachers who had once overlooked her now saw her potential. On the last day of school, Principal Winters made a surprise announcement during the final assembly. "Before we conclude this year," he said, his voice ringing out across the auditorium, "I'd like to recognize a student who has shown extraordinary courage and resilience. Emily Parker, would you please come to the stage?" Stunned, Emily made her way to the front of the auditorium, acutely aware of all eyes on her. As she climbed the steps to the stage, she heard scattered applause that quickly grew into a thunderous ovation. Principal Winters smiled as he shook her hand. "Emily," he said, loud enough for all to hear, "on behalf of the entire Westfield High community, I want to thank you for your bravery in standing up against injustice. Your actions have not only changed this school for the better, but have inspired all of us to be more vigilant and compassionate." He turned to address the entire student body. "Let Emily's courage serve as an example to us all. No one should ever have to suffer in silence. If you see something wrong, speak up. Stand up for yourselves and for each other. Together, we can create a school environment where everyone feels safe, respected, and valued." As Emily looked out over the sea of faces, some familiar, some not, but all looking at her with newfound respect, she felt a surge of emotion. This moment, this recognition, was the culmination of years of struggle and perseverance. But more than that, it was a new beginning. As she stood there, bathed in the warm glow of applause and acceptance, Emily realized that her journey was far from over. She had found her voice, her strength, and she was determined to use it to help others who might be suffering in silence. As the assembly concluded and students began to file out for the summer, Emily was surrounded by well-wishers and friends. Jake appeared at her side, grinning broadly. "So, Emily Parker, hero of Westfield High," he teased gently. "What's next for you?" Emily laughed, a sound of pure joy that she hadn't experienced in years. "Honestly, I'm not sure. But for the first time in a long time, I'm excited to find out." As she left the school that day, Emily felt a sense of possibility that had been absent for so long. The future stretched out before her, full of promise and potential. She had faced her tormentor, found her strength, and emerged victorious. And as she stepped out into the bright summer sunshine, Emily knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, she was ready to face them head-on. The scared, timid girl who had suffered in silence for so long was gone. In her place stood a young woman who had discovered her own power and was ready to take on the world. The story of Emily Parker and Mr. Blackwood would be remembered at Westfield High for years to come. It served as a reminder that one person's courage could ignite a movement, that speaking up against injustice could create lasting change. And for Emily herself, it was just the beginning of and for Emily herself, It was just the beginning of a journey that would shape not only her life, but the lives of countless others. As Emily entered her senior year at Westfield High, she found herself in a position she never could have imagined just a few months earlier. Her academic performance had improved dramatically, and she was now considered one of the top students in her class. Teachers who had once overlooked her now praised her insightful contributions and dedication to her studies. But more than that, Emily had become a symbol of resilience and change within the school. Younger students looked up to her, often approaching her for advice or simply to express their admiration. Emily took this new role seriously, always making time to listen and offer support to those who needed it. The school itself had undergone significant changes in the wake of the Blackwood incident. True to their word, the administration had implemented new training programs for staff and a confidential reporting system for students. There was a palpable shift in the atmosphere. Students and teachers alike seemed more aware, more willing to speak up when they saw something wrong. Emily's newfound confidence extended beyond academics. She joined the school's debate team, discovering a talent for public speaking that surprised even herself. In her first competition, she delivered a powerful speech on the importance of standing up against bullying and abuse, moving many in the audience to tears and securing first place for her team. As college application season approached, Emily found herself facing a new challenge, deciding where to apply. With her improved grades and impressive extracurricular activities, she had options she never thought possible before. Jake, who had become one of her closest friends, often joked that she'd have to beat universities off with a stick. One crisp autumn day, as Emily was working on her college essays in the school library, she was approached by Ms. Thompson, the school board representative who had been involved in the Blackwood investigation. "Emily," Ms. Thompson said warmly, "do you have a moment to chat?" Emily nodded, curious about what Ms. Thompson might want to discuss. "I wanted to let you know that your story has had an impact far beyond Westfield High," Ms. Thompson began. "We've been contacted by several other school districts interested in implementing similar reporting systems and training programs. And, well, there's something else I wanted to discuss with you." Emily leaned forward, intrigued. A group of educators and child advocates is putting together a conference on creating safe and supportive school environments, Ms. Thompson continued. "They've asked if you would be willing to speak about your experiences and the changes that have happened here at Westfield." Emily's eyes widened in surprise. "Me? Speak at a conference?" Ms. Thompson smiled. "Yes, you. Your story is powerful, Emily. It could inspire real change in schools across the country. Of course, it's entirely up to you. I know it might be difficult to revisit those experiences." Emily sat back, considering the offer. The thought of speaking in front of a large group of adults was intimidating, but she couldn't deny the potential impact. If her story could help prevent other students from going through what she had experienced. "I'll do it," Emily said firmly. "When is the conference?" Ms. Thompson beamed. "It's during winter break. I'll get you all the details. And Emily, thank you. Your courage continues to amaze me." As Ms. Thompson walked away, Emily felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. She had a lot of work to do to prepare for the conference, on top of her regular schoolwork and college applications. But she was determined to make the most of this opportunity. Over the next few months, Emily threw herself into preparation for the conference. She worked with her debate coach to refine her public speaking skills and spent hours crafting her speech. She wanted to strike the right balance, acknowledging the pain of her past experiences while focusing on the positive changes that had resulted from speaking out. As the date of the conference approached, Emily's nerves began to get the better of her. What if she froze up on stage? What if no one believed her story? What if she let down all the people who were counting on her? The night before the conference, as Emily was doing one final run-through of her speech in her bedroom, there was a soft knock at her door. Her mother poked her head in, a concerned look on her face. "Emily, honey, are you okay? You've been up here for hours." Emily sighed, setting down her notes. "I'm just nervous, Mom. This is such a big deal, and I don't want to mess it up." Her mother came in and sat beside her on the bed, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "Oh, sweetie, you're not going to mess anything up. You know why?" Emily shook her head. "Because you're speaking from your heart," her mother said softly. "You're telling your truth, and that's the most powerful thing you can do." Emily leaned into her mother's embrace, feeling some of her anxiety melt away. "Thanks, Mom. I don't know what I'd do without you." The next morning, Emily stood backstage at the conference center, her heart pounding in her chest. She could hear the murmur of the audience on the other side of the curtain, educators, administrators, and child advocates from all over the country. As the moderator began to introduce her, Emily took a deep breath, remembering her mother's words. She was speaking her truth. That was all that mattered. And now, please welcome Emily Parker, student at Westfield High School. Emily walked onto the stage, blinking in the bright lights. As she approached the podium, she saw hundreds of faces looking back at her expectantly. For a moment, she felt a flicker of the old fear, the desire to make herself small and invisible. But then she remembered everything she had been through, everything she had overcome. She wasn't that scared, silent girl anymore. She had found her voice, and it was time to use it. "Good morning," Emily began, her voice clear and strong. "My name is Emily Parker, and I'm here today to tell you a story. It's not an easy story to tell, but it's an important one. It's a story about abuse, about silence, and ultimately, about the power of speaking up." As Emily recounted her experiences with Mr. Blackwood, the audience listened in rapt attention. She could see shock, anger, and sadness on their faces as she described the years of verbal abuse and humiliation she had endured. But as she moved on to talk about finding the courage to speak out, about the support she had received from her classmates and the changes that had been implemented at Westfield High, she saw something else in their eyes: hope. "The most important lesson I've learned through all of this," Emily said as she neared the end of her speech, "is that one voice can make a difference. It might seem impossible when you're in the midst of it, when you feel small and powerless. But I'm standing here today as proof that speaking up can create real change." She paused, looking out over the audience. As educators and advocates, you have the power to create environments where students feel safe to speak up, where they know they'll be heard and supported. I challenge each of you to go back to your schools and ask yourselves, are we doing enough? Are we really listening to our students? Because I can tell you from experience, the cost of silence is too high. As Emily finished her speech, there was a moment of silence. Then, slowly, the audience rose to their feet, applauding loudly. Emily felt tears prick at her eyes as she took in the standing ovation, overwhelmed by the response. After the conference, Emily was approached by numerous attendees, all eager to shake her hand and thank her for sharing her story. Several school administrators asked for her input on how to implement similar changes in their own districts. As Emily made her way through the crowd, she spotted a familiar face, Jake, grinning broadly and holding a bouquet of flowers. "Jake," she exclaimed, surprised and delighted. "What are you doing here?" He shrugged, handing her the flowers. "Did you really think I'd miss your big debut? You were amazing up there, Em." Emily hugged him tightly, grateful for his support. As they pulled apart, she noticed Jake looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "What?" she asked, suddenly self-conscious. Jake shook his head, smiling. "Nothing. It's just, you've come so far, you know? I'm really proud of you." Emily felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words. "Thanks, Jake. I couldn't have done it without you and everyone else who supported me." As they left the conference center together, Emily felt a sense of accomplishment unlike anything she had experienced before. She had faced her fears, shared her story, and potentially made a difference in the lives of countless students she would never meet. The future stretched out before her, full of possibilities. She had college applications to finish, a senior year to enjoy, and who knew what else life might bring. But whatever challenges lay ahead, Emily knew she was ready to face them. She had found her voice, and she intended to keep using it. As she and Jake walked into the crisp winter air, laughing and talking about the conference, Emily realized something profound. The story of Mr. Blackwood and the years of abuse she had endured would always be a part of her. But it no longer defined her. Instead, it had become the catalyst for her transformation from victim to advocate, from silent sufferer to powerful voice for change. And as the sun set on that transformative day, Emily Parker stepped forward into her future, ready to take on whatever came next, knowing that her voice and her truth were her greatest strengths.